So I'm going to start off by telling you two things that might sound contradictory, but stick with me on this. First of all, I don't think Veilguard's as bad of a game as people make it out to be. I don't think it's that great either, but I don't think it's horrible. It's alright, it's a game. I don't usually give numbered reviews on this channel, but if I did, I'd give Veilguard like a 7 out of 10. So what does that mean? Well, for me, a 5 out of 10 is like purely average. Doesn't do anything good or anything bad, it just sort of exists. If a game does more good than bad, the number goes up. If it does more bad than good, number goes down. Radical concept, I know. And Veilguard to me does more good than bad, which is probably controversial to some people. And you might be wondering, where do the other Dragon Age games rate in comparison to Veilguard? Good question. The second thing I want to mention is that I don't really care for Veilguard. I just don't. And when I finished my second playthrough, yes, my second playthrough, I lost all the footage on my first one. And when I finished it, I just had this feeling that I couldn't really describe. And it wasn't like apathy or something pretentious like, what, ennui. I just felt so neutral about it. I guess the only way I could describe Veilguard is that it plays the way white bread tastes. And I don't really think that's bad. There's plenty of good games out there that I just played and just said, yeah, that's alright, and then just moved on. The problem here is that I just don't think Veilguard does enough. And I don't know if it's because I've just fallen out of love with Dragon Age, or if what I'm looking for these days is just not available in this series. Which is a shame because of how much I love this series over the years. And granted, this isn't really a Veilguard problem, because I've had this issue back when I went to take a look at Inquisition, but we're here to talk about Veilguard, and I'm gonna try and do it in the most objective way I can. Okay, that's not true, I'm gonna be plenty subjective. But later on, I also want to talk about something that's been getting to me when talking about video games these days, and it really just ends up coming to a head when Veilguard was released. But that's a bridge we're gonna cross to when we get to it later in this video. Dragon Age the Veilguard is the fourth mainline release in the Dragon Age series that was released 10 years after Inquisition's Trespasser DLC. The story also conveniently takes place 10 years after the events of that DLC. At the end of Trespasser, we learn that the Veil, the barrier that separates Thedas from the Fade, was created by Solus to jail away the elven gods, also known as the Evanuris. And this creation of the Veil ended up making things worse for the elves, notably taking away their immortality. Solus, wanting to undo his big oopsie, decided that the best course of action was to tear down the Veil, which would flood Thedas with so much magic and essentially be like performing a hard reset on the world and hoping things don't get extremely fucked up in the process. Varric, a member of the Inquisition, former companion to Hawke from Dragon Age 2, and the Viscount of Kirkwall, which is a title I keep forgetting he has, created a team called the Veilguard, which consisted of himself, Lace Harding, another Inquisition member, and Rook, the player character, with the goal of stopping Solus from destroying the Veil. Oh, so that's why it's called Veilguard. The game's story is alright, but it's not really my kind of thing anymore. It's another save-the-world fantasy story, which is fine, but the idea just now feels very generic and boring to me. The story starts off in Minrathous, where Rook, Varric, and Harding are looking for a contact named Nev Gallus who is going to help with stopping Solus. When they find Solus performing his ritual, demons begin to flood the world and Varric attempts to talk Solus down from it, while we try to disrupt his ritual by tearing down the site. While we did stop the ritual, the weakening veil did allow two of the elven gods, Elgar'nan and Gillenane, to break free from their fate prison, and now Solus is taking their place. Also, Varric got stabbed by Solus. Now, with these two elven gods free, they brought about with them the Sixth Blight and planned to take over a blighted Thedas. It's a simple premise, one I might have enjoyed years ago, but now I just feel like it's just too simple, especially given how Dragon Age itself has had various topics relating to political and social matters, especially with regards to topics such as racism, discrimination, and corruption. We don't really get much of that in Veilguard though, and in some cases, I kinda get it. Some topics of discrimination in the previous games involve the mages, given how people in southern Thedas would be more fearful of magic and have some of the more restrictive circles on the continent. Veilguard, however, takes place entirely in northern Thedas, where attitudes towards magic and mages would differ. I mean, we head to Deventer in this game, a country where only mages get to rule, with circles that act more like schools than prisons, or Rivain, where some mages willingly let spirits possess them and become seers. But for some of the other topics, they're barely touched upon in the story or even the side quests, either to focus on a character's personal struggles or to focus on the threat of the Evanuris, making the story less about Thedas, so you feel a bit disconnected from the world, which doesn't help when your base of operations is in a place called the Lighthouse, located right in the Fade. The game's writing has also been a point of criticism, mostly with regards to the dialogue, and to an extent, I agree. The start of the game has some of the more awkward and stilted bits of dialogue, but I find that it starts to find its footing by the time you recruit a character named Davrin, which doesn't take too long. thankfully, but it still takes a while. The most awkward dialogue, and the one that I feel showcases the main problem with the game's writing, is this cutscene where Harding expresses some regrets about the Day of Souls' ritual, and she has this back and forth with Nev where they talk each other up. Now, on a fundamental level, something like this isn't an issue. In fact, it can tell us a bit about the characters, what they're like, how they choose to go about things, and develop a dynamic that could evolve throughout the rest of the game. That's not what we got. Instead, what we have is Nev and Harding telling each other what their strengths are, and we're still around the start of the game.
You know, I like that about you, Lace. You don't stop fighting, you push for answers and action, while I can get stuck on questions forever.
Well, we need someone who can put the pieces of the puzzle together. We're fighting the unknown.
Exactly. Everyone has a part to play.
Show don't tell is a narrative technique which is used to tell a story through the means of a character's emotions, actions, and subtext. Guess what's not used here? Yeah, I know. I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards. This is one of the main problems with the writing. We get told a lot of things, but we don't get to see a lot. There's one character, Bellara, whose dialogue is predominantly tell don't show, especially around the earlier parts of the game, such as talking about a town's dock. And I can understand that this could be a case of a character being really awkward and has to spell everything out for you kind of deal, but that becomes really hard to defend when other characters also do this regularly. And if I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know if the writing did get better or if it was just something I got used to that started to feel normal to me. The part of the story that does really get good, sadly, is the final act where you take on Eldernon, who takes over Minrathous. I say sadly because I'm not gonna put forward the argument of, trust me bro, the writing gets really good at the end of the game. That is at least like 24 hours long if you don't do any side quests. It's a shame because that is honestly the best part of the game. The first act felt alright in trying to set the pace, and when it started to find its footing, it began to fall off, and it's mostly due to all these companion quests that I had to do, which were the majority of the game now that I think about it. But when you reach that point of no return going into the final act, they really did give it their all, and makes me wonder if they wrote the ending to the game first and then went back to rewrite the earlier sections. But one part of the game that is an improvement to me compared with the previous entry are the levels we get to explore. Rather than carrying on with this semi-open world level design of Inquisition, Veilguard has gone for a more condensed and discrete level design, and each one looks amazing. My personal favorite is Treviso and Antiva, but I did enjoy finally getting to see Minrathous. I do wish that we still had a focus on one country rather than all of Northern Thedas, because we do end up missing out on some of the world building and visual storytelling. I want to use Tevinter as an example here. What we know from previous games is that Tevinter is a city run by mages, and there's a lot of social issues ranging from racism, discrimination of those who are mages, and slavery. The only part of Tevinter we get to properly see is Docktown, which is a district where a lot of the commoners live, and there's far less mages here. And our idea of what Tevinter is, from what was even told to us by people who are from Tevinter, is not shown here. Now I understand that maybe they just didn't want to have depictions of slavery in this game, but I'd argue that we don't get to see the other ugly sides of Minrathous because we don't get to go to the places where those happen. We don't get to see the fancier parts where the magisters live with their slaves, just the poorer run-down areas, and we miss out on this world building and storytelling because we don't get to explore the whole country, or at the very least, more of the countries we do go to. And even when we had 2 countries to travel between, Orlais and Ferelden, we did get to see the differences between them in terms of world design and culture. And while each area in Veilguard does have its own design and style, Minrathous culturally doesn't feel all too different from Treviso. The most notable change in the game compared to the previous entries is the combat, which said, fuck it, go full action RPG. And I'm not mad at that. In fact, I actually prefer it. I think the combat is fun, and it felt like the logical progression for the series ever since Dragon Age 2, where they started adding elements of action combat to their real-time with pause system. Then came Inquisition and did its half action combat, half real-time with pause, and that just stopped being fun for everyone. Now I'm not going to be comparing Veilguard's combat to the previous games because of how different it is, but it feels like a refreshing change if you're someone who isn't a big fan of the older system that was in Origins and Dragon Age 2, like myself, given how open I was about my opinions on real-time with pause systems. Another change is that the max party size is now 3 instead of 4, and you're not able to control other party members, only really being able to give them quick orders in combat, which, again, is fine with me because that's how I usually played in the other games. The same 3 classes return with Mage, Warrior, and Rogue, and each class has this big skill tree to explore and 3 specializations you can build into. Each class also has 2 weapons they can swap between, such as the Warrior being able to swap between a sword and shield and a 2-handed hammer or axe. What's nice is you're able to respec your character anytime you wish at absolutely no cost, being able to easily refund individual skill points whenever you like, which is a nice quality of life change. This was also the first time that I played a Warrior in the series, mostly because I wanted to sword and board, and I liked it, but after a while it does get a bit tiring. Now I could have chosen to respec to try out something different, or maybe swap my weapons more often, so that's really entirely on me. My first playthrough was as a mage, and it might be because I wasn't sure how to build my character, but I felt like I was struggling in combat at times, especially given there's this timed blocking mechanic in the game, and it just felt weird as a mage. Even when I wanted a warrior party member to pull aggro from the enemies so I can more easily cast my spells. One thing to also note is that combat also revolves around this mechanic of primers and detonators. Each class has a different status that they can inflict on enemies, such as Sundered, which reduces an enemy's armor, or Weakened, which makes the enemies weaker. That one's kind of obvious, you didn't need me to tell you that one. And other classes can then detonate those effects, dealing this pretty sizable blast. And so you'd most likely go out into the world with a party consisting of someone from each class, so you can use all these effects whenever you need and detonate them when appropriate. The problem is that the status effects themselves are a whole lot stronger, and it's just overall better to wait until the last moment to detonate them, which I don't know if that's intended or not, but at that point, why would I choose to detonate them and not just wait? Even the game tells you, hey, you can detonate and combo off of this, but there's just no point when that's an overall detriment. Honestly, the biggest sin that this game has for me is the fact that I liked being a warrior more than a mage, which is my favorite class in all of Dragon Age, and another reminder that I wish they just brought back Arcane Warrior. No, I will not let this go. And actually, playing as a mage also felt odd, because for the first time in the series, it didn't feel that impactful being a mage, and I feel that's partly due to us being in Northern Thedas, where the attitude to mages is different, and it's not that we don't get mage-specific dialogue, we do, but they felt too few and far between that I could have just played as another class and got the same experience, which I did. So on my second playthrough to get more footage, I played another class and I did get that same experience, and what I thought was odd was that the dialogue wheel had similar icons to Dragon Age 2 with the different personalities and tones, and so I initially thought, what if Rook's personality would change like Hawk's? So the first time I picked exclusively humorous options, and it felt like it fit Rook pretty well. The second time around, I mixed it up, alternating between the aggressive and diplomatic options, and nothing changed. So I'm now led to believe that Rook is just a very unserious person, and made me wonder if the options I pick really affected anything in the story. Well, kind of, but not in a major way. Sometimes you get these small notifications during certain conversations or actions, and eventually it'll come back with some payoff later, but it's mostly just additional lines of dialogue. I mean, that's kinda neat, but I expected more from it. Rook's personality also remains somewhat stagnant throughout the game. You know what, not even somewhat stagnant, really stagnant. And while I appreciate that you don't get a major tonal shift when picking the different emotions in dialogue, Rook never gets to feel aggressive. The most aggressive option I got was to punch the first warden in the face during one story mission, but in regular dialogue, yeah, you never could, and that is honestly somewhat disappointing. What was cool to see was the amount of times your character's background gets brought up. During character creation, you can pick one of 6 factions for your Rook to be a member of, and these will give you some bonuses like dealing more damage to Darkspawn for the Grey Wardens, or being able to perform takedowns more easily with the Lords of Fortune, or just having an easier time gaining reputation with your chosen faction. And I assumed that'll be the extent of it, but in my playthrough as a Grey Warden, my background got referenced a lot more than expected, even when not talking to other Grey Wardens. For example, at the start of the game, when we get to this blighted village, we find the mayor of the village who let all this happen, and since I'm a Grey Warden, I was given the chance to send him over to the Wardens, and his punishment would be to join and fight the Darkspawn until he died, or he just dies during the joining. Now that was fine for me until I got to a later point in the game where I did find that mayor again, now a fully fledged Warden, and that was something I liked because it felt like my choice did some significance even if it was bits of dialogue, because it's not just some passive bonuses I'll have but completely forget about like an hour in. But the thing about Rook is that even with all of this, with their background, choices, and roleplay, they don't feel like a character who evolves throughout the story. The thing with Rook is that out of all the members of the Veilguard, they're the one who has their shit together. They know who they are as a person, what to do, what to say. There's no real character development for Rook, and I get it. Rook is a reflection of the player, so if you don't grow and change, then neither does Rook. But the role Rook plays when it comes to companion conversations is one that has all the answers and can easily solve all these problems. There's a few times where you have these dialogue sections with companions and they have this little issue between the two of them, and then you step in and resolve the situation easily like you're the parent of the group. A lot of the character growth actually comes from the companions as you complete their respective quest lines. You have a companion from each of the 6 factions, and Harding, and they each have their own quest line which spans the entire game. And that's great, because it means I have the opportunity to rotate my companions about to experience this journey with them, even if I did just take Lucanus and Bellara with me for like 90% of the time. The companion quests this time around revolve around a theme of identity and who they each are with their own respective groups, or just who they are to themselves. Like Davrin's, for example. In his questline, you'll learn that the Griffins aren't entirely extinct, as you learn that there's a clutch of Griffin hatchlings that only a handful of Wardens know about and are raising them to be a part of the Grey Wardens. Davrin has modeled himself as a monster slayer, more like a protector, and soon enough he has to learn to take on the role of a protector in another way, as more like a caregiver or a father figure to a Griffin. It's a lovely story and probably my favorite one, also because my Rook is a Warden, but that's besides the point. The thing that does take me out of these quests is that they aren't closely tied to the main story. They may at times include groups that side with the Elven gods, but that would just be the extent of it, which does disappoint me because compared to the quest lines in Dragon Age 2, each one had some connection to the main Mage-Templar conflict, and they did what they can to try and influence your opinion and decision. But over here, I had to tell Elgar'nan that he has to wait because I need to help my necromancer friend with his fear of death, and also his former half-lich colleague who wants to make a bone golem to attack Navara. Yes, she did work with the Venatori, but there hasn't been much mention of her siding with the gods. And it's not like companion quests have to be tied to the main story. Like, what does having Alistair talk with his sister have to do with stopping the Blight? And what does Dorian talking with his father about how gay he is have to do with stopping Corypheus? It's fine if there are quest lines with no connection to the main story, but when these quest lines are throughout the entire game, where you even have these shorter conversation sections that count as quests that you have to do for your companion, I'd like to have some of it tie back to Elgar'nan or Gillenay, especially since these quest lines are so long and the main threat we have to face is a massive blight upon Thedas. That being said, I did enjoy this cast of characters, but on the other hand, a lot of them felt really one note. I can tell you something about each of them, but when I sit down to really think about what I learned, I can't really come up with much. For example, Lucanus is really into cooking and coffee. The coffee is to help keep him awake so the demon possessing him, Spite, doesn't take control. Or Emmerich, who is a necromancer, but his main fault is his fear of dying, which, albeit funny and ironic for a necromancer to have, I can't really remember as much from him. Nev focuses more on her detective work and cares for Minrathous, and Bellara is really focused on studying ancient elven lore. Davrin is by far my favorite character, but what I mentioned about him being a monster hunter turned griffin caretaker is the main focus of himself and his story. Now, it's not to say that there isn't other things about them. You have moments of dialogue where they'll interact with each other in the lighthouse, and you'll also have moments of their backstory and history come up and some of their dialogue quests, but you mostly get to learn what they're mainly about, such as Emmerich and his fear of dying, and that's what you end up talking about most of the time. Now, Harding is somebody that I liked, and I wanted to find out more, especially given how she's gained this magical connection to the stone that has awoken in her from a combat encounter at the start of the game. Now, I think that can be really interesting, and we had her quest focus on that, but at that point, I just found myself less interested as time went on. And I think part of this reason is that we don't get to talk to them freely outside of these set cutscenes. We don't get to have dialogue such as in Inquisition or in Origins, where we just get to learn more about them, their history, little random bits of trivia about them. And I really miss that part because I felt that adds a lot more to these characters. Real quick side tangent, I think it's funny that Harding can be romanced in this game, when in Inquisition you can flirt with her and end up in an unofficial romance with her. Unofficial in that it doesn't function like the other romance options, and I just want to know what an Inquisitor who romanced Harding even thinks about this. But there is one companion that I want to talk a bit more about, and you probably have an idea on who that is. Taash Taash is an interesting character to me, not because of the story written for them, even though that will be something we're going to talk about later, but it's mostly because of the reception this character's received, and this leads into what's been bothering me when it comes to talking about video games or just any piece of media really in this day and age. And I have a structure for all this to put it all together, but I also want to point out that I don't intend for this to be a in defense of Taash section. There's parts of Taash's character that I like and some that I don't like, and honestly I just feel that as a character they're pretty underbaked, just like the rest of the companions in this game, and I don't want this to be a section where I argue that the writing is actually really good. Trust me on that. I do still think that there are issues with the writing and the dialogue, even when I believe they did find their footing. Instead, I just want this to be a section where I give my input and my opinions and air out some frustrations I have every time I see somebody talk about Taash. So to start off, let's talk about Taash as a character and what their personal story is about. Taash is a Qunari companion with the Lords of Fortune who you recruit when you're looking for a dragon hunter. The main focus of their story is about figuring out who they are as a person, given they're stuck between two cultures, being raised with Qunari culture by their mother, Shathan, and being surrounded by Rivaini culture from growing up in Rivain. And this mix of cultures creates some arguments and disagreements between Taash and their mother. Taash's mother means well, but given her background in the Qun as a scholar, she doesn't have the maternal skills of someone like a Tamasrin, leading to moments where her words towards Taash would sound blunt and almost like criticism. Taash, however, does take these words seriously, such as asking Nev if she dresses and acts the way she does to make her mother happy, or even following Qunari customs such as Darsam, which is this rope binding morning routine that they do. During Taash's story, they come out as non-binary, and when coming out to their mother, they even ask why they're never good enough for her. That's what Taash's story is about, figuring out who they are while trying to make their mother happy. And with that, I do want to talk about Taash's coming out scene a bit more, because I believe this fully covers this dynamic with everything you'd have seen leading up to this point. So I'm just going to play the clip first so you can see this exchange, and then we're going to go over it.
So, I'm non-binary.
What does that mean?
It means I don't feel like a man or a woman.
If you are neither a man nor a woman, then what are you?
Non-binary. I just said, and I'm going to use they instead of she from now on.
If this is because I have criticized your dress or your manners...
It isn't!
Under the Qun, the term for one whose gender does not match the one given to them at birth was a Qunathlok. Perhaps you are like that.
Why do you have to keep picking at it? Why can't you just be happy for me?
Evatash, Chakra Toebra.
So I'm supposed to struggle with who I am? Even if I don't feel like I fit, even if I feel wrong?
No, you misunderstood.
Then say it better! Why am I never enough for you?
I will go. Thank you for inviting me to your home. Panahedan.
Pretty straightforward scene. Taash comes out as non-binary and Shathan doesn't know what that is. Taash explains what being non-binary is, and Shathan tries to rationalize it the only way she knows, which causes Taash to lash out, and Shathan then leaves to go back to Rivain. The common sentiment I've seen about this scene is that Taash is the one that's rude and disrespectful to their mother, who only tried to understand them and meet them in the middle, but I don't fully agree with that take. I see that as only looking at this scene from one viewpoint and neglecting Taash's perspective in this conversation. The thing to keep in mind is that Shathan was raised in the Qun, and the Qun has a very rigid view of a person's role in society. You don't get to pick what that role is, and is instead assigned to you based on what is deemed best suited for you based on like your personality and your habits. Shathan being raised as a scholar means that she was not taught how to raise a child or how to be emotionally available to them. She even said herself that she's an inadequate mother and was taught to, as she put it, think critically, analyze without passion, and correct mistakes. All things that she's done while raising Taash, and what she's also done in this conversation alone. What does non-binary mean? What are you if not a man or a woman? This also tells us that the Qun does not have the concept of being non-binary, only seeing roles as being either a masculine role or a feminine role, which is why she then suggests that Taash might be a Qunathlok, the Qun's idea of being transgender. To Taash, this all sounds like criticism of them, similar to an earlier dialogue where they were corrected on their Qunlot pronunciation.
I also see that you used your fire again. Chakra Toebra.
Chakra Toebra.
Remember to keep your consonants crisp. Qunari do not slouch, and neither does our language.
or this little section where Shathan was getting them to help with making dinner.
You swing axes all day. Do you lack the strength to chop a few melons?
Taash's main issue comes when they're reminded of the phrase Shokra to Ebra, which means through struggle you find what you are. But Taash has always misunderstood it as you must struggle against what you are, seeing it as their mother trying to mold them into something and someone they're not, when what Taash wants is to be themselves and just to be accepted by their mother. And the main thing I hope you take away from this bit of brief, quick analysis is that even with the game's clunky and awkward writing, you can see that there's more to it than what's shown on the surface. You can choose to watch this and leave with the idea of Taash is disrespectful to their mother, I don't like Taash, and that's fine, I guess. But I feel that's doing yourself a disservice when you engage with pieces of media, especially if you've played through prior scenes involving Taash and their mother. You'd hope to pick up on some aspects such as Shathan not being as emotionally close to Taash, or Taash seeing themselves as being constantly criticized. And I'm not saying this to shame people either for not picking up on this. I did something similar with Vivienne in Inquisition. Hated her the first time I played, but when it came time for me to replay that game, I wanted to try and understand her character more and found so much depth that I began to really enjoy her character. Now that's not to say that the characters in Veilguard have the same depth and intrigue as a character like Vivienne, at least I didn't really find them like that, but because of my bias against Vivienne, I chose not to understand her and brush off a lot of the interactions, and I honestly believe that's what happened with Taash when people are talking about their character. And one thing I feel that people don't usually do when it comes to talking about Taash is understanding a character's perspective. Now we've done a bit of that when talking about them and their mother, but this does lead me to want to talk briefly about another dialogue cutscene with Taash. This scene has Taash and Nev where they discuss gender dysphoria, and it starts off with Taash asking Nev why she dresses the way she does and asks her if this is to make their mother happy. Taash also scoffs at the idea of wearing a dress and then says it feels right when their mom says that they act more like a man than a woman. When Nev asks Taash whether or not they like being a woman, Taash responds with nobody likes being a woman. Now clearly to me, Taash is struggling with their gender identity and is also projecting their thoughts and struggles out onto others, such as when they wonder why Nev dresses more feminine, they ask immediately, is it to make your mother happy? And when they say nobody likes being a woman, they're expressing their discomfort of being seen as a woman onto others. We can also assume from this dialogue that Taash does not know what being trans is, and they might be thinking, well, I don't like being a woman, so I'd assume that every other woman also doesn't like being a woman. And if your Rook is a woman, then they can rebut this by saying that you do actually like being a woman. And Nev's response shows that she's aware of what Taash is experiencing, given that she herself knows people who are transgender. Now, I use the word clearly when making my point because all the context lines up to Taash experiencing gender dysphoria. I mean, for fuck's sake, they said it feels right when they're told they act more like a man, and them saying nobody likes being a woman means I don't like being a woman. But to some people, this isn't really as clear, thinking that Taash said this as some sort of objective truth and not understanding that their internalized misogyny is due to their own gender dysphoria. Understanding another character's perspective helps to give you a bigger picture of the story, and it feels like people either choose to not do that or they never cultivated that skill in the first place, or maybe just all this rot today has caused them to lose that skill altogether. Criticism of Taash stands out as being harsher than criticism of the rest of the game, and if I'm gonna be honest, it's mostly due to Taash being non-binary and that we also get to see their journey to learning about themselves. Now, some people do this intentionally, like anti-woke grifters, you know, losers. But some people are also doing it subconsciously, and it's not to say that there aren't parts of Taash that can't be critiqued, such as dialogue and tone, but it's noticeable that there's more bitterness towards them. For example, Taash's dialogue is written like that of an angsty teenager. People have pointed this out and treat this like it's a negative part of their character, but Taash is also said by the developers in a Discord Q&A to be the youngest member of the group and that their age is closer to Sarah's, so it makes sense that they'll talk like an angsty teenager. Taash also doesn't know much about the world or about themselves, and given their relationship with their mother, contrasting with a relationship such as Dorian and his father, it adds up that Taash is really young compared to other members of the Veilguard. People also like to fixate on Taash as a non-binary character when that is only one part of their identity issue, given that they also struggle culturally between Kunari and Ravani culture, which Rook can also nudge Taash into either direction. And this fixation on Taash's gender gets used as a point against them in this scene with Taash and Emmerich, where Taash, the only one in the group to find Emmerich's necromancy and his fascination with the dead to be weird, calls him a death mage and a skullfucker, which he sees as derogatory.
I need one of these little needle things to dig some crap out of my armor. Death Mage won't give me one.
First, a bone threader is an extremely delicate instrument. Second, it's Emmerich. Taash, my name is Emmerich, not Death Mage, not Corpse Guy, not... I won't repeat the rest.
And people have taken this scene to sit on their high chair and go, well, how hypocritical of you, Taash, that you want your gender to be respected, but you don't respect that Emmerich is a necromancer. But what they don't realize is that this is actually just a false equivalency. One is misgendering someone, and the other is saying, your hobbies weird me out. The more accurate argument is to call Taash a dragon murderer rather than a dragon hunter, or even just dragon fucker for their fascination with dragons. And if I was being generous, I'd argue that this scene is to show a cultural difference between Nevarra and their customs regarding the dead and other parts of Thedas, but even I think that might be a stretch given it's just Taash that seems to have a problem with Emmerich's dead people hobby. And I know it's easy to say, well, the writing's bad, and leave it at that, but that doesn't really do much to explain why it's bad, and to view scenes where writers are trying to convey a point or explore a topic such as Taash coming out, or them talking with Nev and brushing it off as it's bad writing, is not an example of good criticism. You have to ask, why is it bad writing? Is it bad writing because of the topic, the dialogue, the tone, the interactions? Those are what I'm looking for, and it feels like I can't find that as much these days when YouTube decides to throw videos like Dragon Age Veilguard is a woke disaster at me. Is it bad because they use the word non-binary? Is it bad because the dialogue here is awkward? How does this stand out as different from the other scenes which also has awkward dialogue? I want to talk about one final point, and I'll try and be brief about it because this section has gone on for long enough. This is about Taash being a bad representation of trans and non-binary people, and I have two main issues of this, but really it's just two parts of the same issue. Representation in Dragon Age has been strange to look back on, and there's been moments where they've fallen into stereotypes, such as Zevran and Isabella falling into the promiscuous bisexual stereotype, or Sarah being an angry lesbian trope. Sarah as well being another childish and rude character that could be argued as bad representation for lesbians given how she's the first companion to exclusively be a lesbian, in a similar way that Taash is also childish and rude and being the first non-binary companion. So now is Sarah a bad representation of lesbians because of her personality? Do we now think that lesbians cut their own hair and give themselves bad haircuts? No, of course not. Why would we think that because of just one character? The other point is that if Taash's personality was instead flipped to being more accommodating, less rude and less abrasive, and just being a good child to their mother, I'm sure given the game's writing, people would criticize it and say that they just want the non-binary character to be perfect. Representation is a topic that comes up often, and people talk about good or bad representation, and really, it's only bad when the part you want to be represented is the only thing about their personality. Taash's story involves discovering their gender identity, so it makes sense as well to talk about it and explore it. And side note, it can be a messy journey to go through for many people. But they also talk about being part Kunari and Ravani culture and their relationship with their mother. They're not just the non-binary companion. On top of that, there's going to be characters with bad writing. There's tons of characters who are cisgender and straight with bad writing. It only makes sense that there's going to be LGBT characters with bad writing as well. And characters who aren't written perfectly aren't really that bad, okay? Yeah, it might suck, but it's fine. And these characters can be good, they can be unlikable, because they're people, and people are varied. The problem comes when they're looked at as a person to represent an entire group, and that is honestly too much for just one character. People have talked about Krem from Inquisition as a form of good representation of trans people, but we only really got to see Krem after he came into his own as a trans man. We never got to see him discovering himself, and we never got to see the process of him coming out or transitioning. We don't know if it was a messy transition, and we don't know how much Krem fixated on his gender identity before. So I want to argue that Krem is a representation of trans people, and Taash is a representation of trans and non-binary people. They're two different people with two different personalities, and I believe this comes about with people already having a negative opinion about this game, and this has shaped their opinion about other aspects of it. And I just want to say, before anyone says anything, it's fine to not like Taash as a character. It's fine to criticize the writing. It's fine to even not like this game entirely. But my problem is when it comes to talking about art and media these days is when it's done with malice. And you can tell when it's done with malice rather than criticism, especially when it's a grift. And you can tell that when you upload 4 fucking videos talking about a game you don't like. Fucking move on, dude. There's other things out there to do and talk about. How about you go have fun and discover happiness for once in your life? Also, you know where this shot of Taash came from? It came from this scene where their mom gets killed in front of them. Wow, look at how awful Taash looks. Why can't you look better when your mom dies? And also, in case you're wondering where it is, I'm not going to talk about the pulling a barf scene, alright? I don't care for it. I don't give a shit. It's a dumb little scene that came and went. If it wasn't included in this game, it wouldn't have changed things drastic. And I think that people get more annoyed about that scene than anything else. I mean, for fuck's sake, the Iron Bull gets hit in the gut with a stick to fight his fears of like what he saw in the fades. Oh yeah, and the Iron Bull and Taash were written by the same writer, Trick Weeks, so do with that what you will. At some point, I put down Veilguard and I stepped away from working on my videos because this whole climate just got way too exhausting to deal with. So I went away to play some other games, other RPGs, and I was just having a good time. And at some point while working on these Dragon Age videos, I thought back to Veilguard and realized that it felt really awkward for a single player RPG. Some of the game's design choices just felt weird to me. Like, we had 6 factions and they had their own associated levels and you would complete quests to build reputation with them. And I also realized you can only have a party size of 3 where you can take one of each class, which has their own set of primers and detonators, encouraging a group of warrior, rogue, and mage. And on top of that, the itemization and skill trees of the game felt really reminiscent of skill trees and items you'd find in games like in ARPGs, where some of them are also like seasonal live service games. I mean, I guess, does that count? You can tell I really don't play ARPGs. And it's also these little things, such as when you get a new side quest, or when you have these dialogue cutscenes where everyone's standing in the same spot, not moving about, or when Rook does their fucking superhero pose every goddamn time. Not to mention how Rook's dialogue doesn't really feel as impactful as the Inquisitors, for example. How the emotions might not fully line up, or how we don't get to have as much of an impact on the story and events regardless of the dialogue choices we get to pick. And that's when it dawned on me. If you didn't know, during Veilguard's development, it was actually going to be a live service multiplayer game, and I believe what we got here are the remnants of that live service game. And I can already picture it. Your base of operations being in the Fade, so you can easily travel to these different regions. You'd probably have daily or weekly quests such as thwart Venatori plans in Minrathous, help the Crows with an assassination in Treviso, or like kill 20 Darkspawn in the Anderfels, and you slowly build reputation with each faction to get better weapons and armor, teaming up with 2 other people, ideally of different classes, to create these synergies, sort of like whatever was going on with Anthem. And I thought I had it all figured out. It all made sense to me why Veilguard was in the state it was, and I wanted to include this in my video as a way of going, I figured it out. I found out why Veilguard feels weird and why it kinda sucks. And then Jason Schreier came out with this article on Bloomberg that kinda confirmed my suspicions, and now I can't really feel special with my non-existent internet celebrity status. And you know, it's frustrating being a Dragon Age fan. It's frustrating because every game after Origins has had issues with development. Dragon Age 2 had a 16-month deadline. Inquisition had to use a game engine they were unfamiliar with that was also not made to create role-playing games. And now we have Veilguard, which has its own set of problems. So here's a brief history of the development of this game. It started back in 2015 under the name Project Joplin. It was going to take place in the Da Vinci Imperium and have a smaller focus compared to Inquisition to allow for more player interaction, choices, and reactivity. Project Joplin was then cancelled in 2017 when many developers were either pulled to the Mass Effect team to help finish the development of Andromeda, and others were moved to focus on the development of Anthem. This was also the time when many of Bioware's staff members, including veteran employees like Mike Laidlaw, left the company. Development of a 4th Dragon Age game started up again as Project Morrison, and this would eventually come to be known as Dragon Age Dreadwolf. This time with the focus being that it was going to be a live service multiplayer game because that's what EA wanted. Now that decision was eventually overturned when EA realized that there was always a market for single player games when they saw the success success of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and compared that to the dumpster fire that is Anthem, which shut down its servers in 2021. Now, normally when a project has a massive shift in focus like this, it would be given the opportunity to restart and go into pre-production. Yeah, that's not what happened. The team was given about 18 months to restructure the game and rework the story to fit a single-player narrative. And yes, I know, Veilguard isn't that great of a game, it very much has its flaws, but honestly, it's impressive that they managed to release a game that's complete, runs smoothly, and has a minimal amount of bugs. They had to repurpose what they had to make a single-player game, and it's honestly so disappointing to see, because I want to believe that with a proper pre-production phase with the shift back to single-player, they could have created something hundreds of times better than what we have now. The writing could have been more refined, the companions would have been more interesting, our choices could have had more of an impact on the story, and on top of that, we'd have more than 3 choices from Inquisition to have an effect on our world state. That's the other thing, world states aren't even a thing in this, giving us only 3 major choices from Inquisition to have an effect, and it barely changed anything. At first, I was fine with it because I didn't think the world states did much apart from just give us some new flavor text, and I wanted to see more concrete changes. And I thought this was just the developers being open that, yeah, we're not really going to use a lot of choices. And now I don't even believe that, and I just think that they didn't have enough time to account for 3 games worth of decisions. Going back to the Bloomberg article, it was interesting to see how EA plays favorites with the different Bioware teams, giving the Mass Effect team an easier time when they needed something compared to the Dragon Age team who had to keep fighting an uphill battle, as well as there being this animosity between the 2 teams from what David Gator has also mentioned. It honestly felt like a 4th Dragon Age game was just doomed from the start, or more accurately, from the cancellation of Project Joplin. And it's easy to blame EA for these problems, and while they're at fault here, some of the fault also lies with Bioware management. However, the biggest slap in the face had to have come from EA CEO Andrew Wilson, who said that Veilguard would have probably been more successful if it was a live service game. If it was a live service game, I'm so tired. I hate this so fucking. I think I'm done with Dragon Age. I don't know what it is, but I think I'm done with this whole save the world fantasy storytelling. It's one reason why I think the best story in the series is actually Dragon Age 2. And it's sad really, getting this game after 10 years only to find out that you've fallen out of love with it. And it's not because of Veilguard, mind you. I felt this way when replaying Inquisition. Given the reception that Veilguard received, as well as the poor management at both Bioware and EA, as well as the layoffs, again, I'm not expecting a 5th Dragon Age game. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Veilguard ended a story that was set up 10 years ago, a chapter is over, and Thetis can now rest. And you know, there's actually a secret ending that I missed because you had to collect like 3 items or something, and I don't really feel like playing through the game a 3rd time, so I think I'm just gonna look up the ending. I don't want a 5th Dragon Age game. The secret ending is this cutscene which reveals that everything bad in the previous games was orchestrated by this secretive evil group, and I hate that. At one point, it shows Loghain about to withdraw from the Battle of Ostagar, and he did so because he was told to do so, which entirely ruins Loghain's character. Turns out, it wasn't because of his opinion of King Cailan, or the fact that Cailan was getting closer to Orlais, and this implies that they're the ones who also planted the red lyrium idol, and what, they got Solus to give Corypheus the orb to open the breach? I hate this so much. This is the worst part of the game. I could forgive the rest of the game for its problems, but this part right here, this is garbage. If you want bad writing, this is it. This is something that should have been scrapped. You know, I don't want a 5th Dragon Age game if this is what the story is going to be about. If there's going to be a 5th one, then I can just tell you, I'm not going to play it. You don't want a 5th Dragon Age game because you don't think Bioware can make a good one. I don't want a 5th Dragon Age game because this cliffhanger sucks. We are not the same.